We do record a number of our sessions, primarily governance, but I've started the recording. We have a YouTube channel that I'll surface at the end of the call, where we are trying to get our special presentations and a number of our recordings up from the last year. If you're not comfortable, you can always hop off the call and jump back on, and review the recording at your leisure. So for the folks that are listening to the recording, I'm just walking through our current kind of must support guidance and our hopes to kind of look at this from an approach, comparing it against the types of terms and the types of codes that we use to describe similar system behavior and behavioral expectations in a new FHIR extension that is obviously very experimental still, but that could offer us maybe common phrases that we can use as a shared reference point for this type of discussion. So I think the biggest things, I think just two things I'll call out is we started in the last, 6 months as we got more and more refined in what our profiles were for due diligence reviews. We started indicating when we would remove something as must support, but we felt very strongly that it's something that implementers should consider also, or I should say that other iGuide authors should consider including must supports in their guides, that we started calling these should supports. So this was kind of a new addition for those in the last 6 months. But that ultimately we tried to keep a loose expectation around what our must supports meant for receivers and for clients and servers in creation and querying scenarios. I think the biggest underlying theme here is that we knew as a guide that may be derived and used, in our Canadian community, that the nature of must support meant that any guide that perhaps derived or reprofiled from our profiles would have to carry over our must supports. So we were very careful in trying to say, even if something is optional and we've applied it as must support, like line C here, when we say you shall send and relay as a server, if you have the value and it's appropriate, and you shall be capable of maybe receiving, relaying, or storing, that we aren't going into more specifics into the business rules or the business impact, and that ultimately those types of decisions about what does your system do with it, does it display it, how does it persist it, how long, all of those things would have to be determined closer to the actual implementation layer. Do folks want to spend more time walking through the individual scenarios before we look at do a quick overview of the obligation and then try to kind of match them in places that we have some similarities? Because I think we talked a little bit on our last call about this optional must support as yes, and then I think we talked about mandatory and must support as yes. But I do want to allow folks, we can catch up if there are folks that haven't gotten deep in the guide yet.
Sheridan, I haven't gotten deep in the guide. I'll tell you, I'm mostly in listening mode because I haven't been a part of the previous conversations. I'm following everything you're saying so far. But that's about the extent that I can contribute at this point.
Okay. Why don't we spend just a little bit, I think because we're talking about must support, maybe just do a little bit of recap on these two, because I think that's really probably where we'd be doing our comparison.
Yeah, Sheridan, we've got multiple comments in here that say you should not send the element if the value is no.
Yep, right here in the query with it being
it's all over. It appears twice in that column, it appears in the next column, etc. We're meaning this from an original source perspective, that there was no source value, that you should not be sending the source value.
It's don't send the structure of the element if you don't have anything for the element. So
if you don't have anything, then it should be a shall.
Well, FHIR actually, if you don't have anything, you can't send the element.
Correct. That's
why you can't send an empty element in FHIR.
Right. Now, that's why I was asking whether you were talking about whether or not you didn't have a source value, right? Because you could be sending a data absent reason, and that would be appropriate.
Mhm.
But you can't be sending an empty, so you can't be sending an empty FHIR element. So are we talking about if you don't have a value, you shouldn't be sending an object in the or an element in the FHIR object? Or are we saying if you don't have the source value, you should or shouldn't be sending a data absent reason?
No, I think my recollection is it's primer, but I'll let anyone pipe in if their interpretation I mean, it's been like 3 years, I think, since we made the table, so it's been a little bit, but I don't think what we were trying to do was discourage the use of DARs in these scenarios. Is that like similar to others' interpretations of this and recollection of collaborating on these definitions?
I understand
Well,
it. We put that in
yeah, go ahead.
so that you didn't send the empty thing just saying, or wasn't required to send an empty one saying we didn't have a value all the time, or something that would never have a value.
Well, it wasn't really to prevent the sending of a data absent reason. It's
Correct.
just, I think we're just saying that yeah, there's no requirement to send anything if you don't have a value in the first place. But if you have something, you should send it. But the data absent reason isn't really part of that equation.
Does that change your interpretation, Paul? Because I know that there are a couple of things.
If that's the case, yeah, if that's what you're trying to say, then it shouldn't be a should, it should be a shall. If you don't have an original data element, you shall not send an element.
And so if we were to do that clarifying, do you think it makes sense to also then make that statement about this doesn't preclude the use of DAR in systems that are sending, because that can come with additional.
Yeah, I would add that clarification.
Yeah.
Or actually, what we should maybe say is, if you don't have an original value or a DAR, then you shall not send a value. You shall not send an element.
And I think, so this speaks to basically system behaviors, right? What are our expectation for what a system does when it has missing, or when it doesn't have information and it constructs a resource and shares it? Do we think that in thinking about our current definitions, that this provide that level of specificity of a correction provides value over perhaps removing it if this is technically not required, or if it's confusing to our readers?
Well, it's not accurate. So then either we make it accurate or we remove it and assume that people will know what the rules are.
What do folks think we should do with those two options?
I just had a question. Like earlier, I think someone said that if you don't have a value, like the default in FHIR is that you shouldn't send it. Is that correct?
Sorry? No, if you don't have a value, there should be no element.
Right. So if that's like a standard
behavior.
rule, yeah, or standard
Yeah.
behavior, what does this information really communicate? Like if that's standard, why put that information in this table if it's already the way that people are doing things today?
Because not everybody does it that way. A lot of them use those data absent reason things to stick in for a value that's never present.
Yeah, the only place. So if it's an optional data element, to stick in a data absent reason often is not helpful. So it may have been just to surface rules all up into a readily accessible place, rather than we'll supply certain rules and you have to go for the other places for the other rules. Otherwise, you're sort of lining up several lenses for someone to try and figure out at the end of the day, what am I supposed to do? So to me, it sort of looks like the idea behind this table was to draw all of those rules up to the front for a developer so they could see them all there.
Yeah, because a lot of this stuff
Okay.
is touched on in the base specification around like, you know, assuming the value will be received. And I think we may have moved away from this language, but we talked about like don't error out, which is like just rules of the road. But that oftentimes it was like when we're trying to comprehensively describe what we wanted, we did in some places duplicate the guidance of the base spec.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing,
Mhm.
because, you know, please read the entire spec. It's, it's a large changing object.
I think I'm
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think I'm starting to see what Paul is alluding to. And maybe should not isn't quite the right wording that we want. Maybe it's something like no obligation to set element of the value was null.
Oh no, if you have no value, you have an obligation to send no element.
Does that contradict the use of data absent reasons?
No, sorry, to be more complete, if you don't have a value or a data, so there are two types of values you can have. You can either have an actual data value or a data absent reason. If
Okay.
you don't have either of those, then there shall be no element.
I agree. That makes sense.
So if you have no value or no data absent reason, you have no obligation to send an element.
No, you have an obligation not to send an element.
Yeah, we don't want people sending blanks, for example.
Is the intent of this statement to discourage use of data absent reason?
More or
Okay.
less. It's to discourage making those kind of things required.
Right. We aren't saying if you've got nothing, send data absent reason as a general rule.
No, that's not being said here.
Well, I'm wondering if we are saying don't do that. Right? If the intent here is if you have nothing to say, don't say anything at all. Versus if you don't have anything to say that you don't have anything to say.
It kind of goes with the whole mindset of using a data absent reason, sort of like saying we intentionally left this blank, which is okay
Right.
on the one hand, but on the other hand, when you put a value in, how are we validating that that value is correct? We don't do anything to do that. It's kind of a disjunction in the way this stuff's done, where you have to validate that you don't have a value, but if you do have a value, you don't have to validate that it's right or even should be there. And I think that's kind of why I lean towards not using these DARs, because they really don't make a sense in 99% of the cases.
They're valuable when you have a required data, right? Because you don't have a data value. And yet it is a requirement that you send something. So the data absent reason allows you to meet the cardinality requirement without having to make up content, right? Fill it with all nines, where we're all supposed to know that all nines means nothing at all.
Correct. And that's why you have the difference between the 0 to 1 and the 1 to 1, or 0 to many and 1 to many.
Well,
Zero,
sometimes you
shouldn't have to do that.
Sometimes you have a one-to-one field where you just
Right.
don't happen to have the data value.
Right. But this comment is applying to the one where it's 0 to 1 or 0 to many, not to the 1 to 1.
Yeah. I mean, there may be
And so if your
times
minimum
where
is 0, you shouldn't have to say that I've got nothing to send.
Are there any
Right.
scenarios where we have implementation guides or implementations where we do send a DAR on elements that are optional in our profiles? Does people come across it?
Something I've been looking to fight against, but I don't know if there is any. There isn't.
I
As
don't
an
know about
example
our
of where it would be
profiles.
useful, I don't know whether or not you are using it, but you could have a circumstance where you know the patient has insurance You just don't have the identifier for it.
Was that along the example that I heard Elliot, you spoke up as well?
Yeah, I was about to say, I don't know of specific instances in our profiles, but I have seen optional elements where, yes, you want to convey either, as Paul said, we know there's a value, we just don't know what it is, or, you know, convey why you don't have this thing in here.
But again, in those cases, wouldn't you be having a minimum of 1 instead of 0? Because you're saying you want the insurance number, and then you put in the DAR because you don't
No,
have it.
because it may not be a required field.
Okay, but if it's not required, then why do you need the DAR?
Because the assertion is a type of information in its own, where you're like trying to provide a new piece of information.
And then again goes back to say, why do you validate that they actually do have insurance when you don't provide it?
Well, they're sort of a tri-state thing, right? I mean, the hospital, using a hospital as an example, hospital's required to treat you whether or not you have insurance, right? So you're going to have to make the PHN field, either you make it required and you create potentially duplicate PHN for people who are unconscious, or you make the PHN field optional, which will either contain a PHN or nothing if the person doesn't have one, or a data absent reason to say they've got one, but we don't know what it is.
Again, I maintain the only reason to put a DAR in is if you have a minimum of 1. If you have a minimum of 0, then why say you don't have one? Just don't
Because
send
it's a
one.
difference between somebody who doesn't have a driver's license and somebody who left it at home.
Thomas, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Well, just to try to get a quick sharing about my opinion here. So far, what I heard actually just all those use case levels, those scenarios, if what, if not. So I think just sharing my opinion may not right, but just, you know, pop up in your mind here. If we think about this coming very popular machine learning, those models, they talk about bidding trading parameters, and in that manner, and we see, okay, we only have about, 1 million scenarios. What if? In that manner, you can imagine how much time we have to stay or stick with this conversation about mass support, which is pretty much be decided to phase out. In my understanding, instead of spending time to talk about mass support definition, which is to pretty much go to the graveyard already, I just propose try to get rid of this mass support definition discussion, move to the what's called obligation extension, or maybe move to another topic. Thank you. Just my personal comment.
Like, I think there might actually, this might be a good example to see, like, is there a obligation that exists today that kind of describes the nuance that we're looking for here? And maybe starting with the one that maybe is more framed in the around the DAR scenario, just given that we've been chatting about it.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Thomas. And then I saw
obligation, because I haven't a chance to really dive into obligation, the long list here. My understanding first, based on the previous definition about mass support in the HLC International webpage, it said, okay, they give the authority to the local or different implementers with the below down the layers to decide how to define the mass support and the logic in their actual implementation guide. But obligation here, they definitely present authority at the international level to say, well, this is mass support. Sorry, this is obligation list of value, which is my understanding, if from terminology perspective, or value set perspective, they're called intentional way. And you give it a description here, but we do open the door based on the definition. If you really go to the use case implementation, you could, based on your understanding, actually the right understanding about intentional definition, to implement it into an extensional way. if, for example, will send eventually all those value codes will be rendered as a rule sets or rule set being put inside with the implementation guide and profiles to fit in those, inject into the code or engine. So in that manner, I would say, yes, we could spend time but talk about mass support, do the comparison, but my personal opinion here is, shall we move forward? Thank you.
So a couple of things I want to call out before we dig into the actual codes, just a little bit about obligation as a heads up. So the idea is that right now in FHIR, it's an extension. It has at minimum, when you go to use it, the intent is to be able to clarify in a computable and a structured way a system behavioral expectation and the specific actors that that expectation is tied to. And so there's a lot that you can convey in an obligation extension, but the two things I want to call out here, because they are relevant in understanding what the codes and the terms that we have to discuss from are constructed. So you've got code, which is a minimum of 1, and you've got actor ID. So what that means is FHIR is now providing, and again, it's an experimental value set, or it's an experimental extension. So this is very early stages. The value set may change, but it says, okay, you're going to define your actor that's important to you and start by trying to describe what your expectations are for producers, for exchangers, for consumers, and that these are each also, the codes within those are hierarchical from the example, we looked at in the past was around, okay, if you're producing a FHIR resource, that the highest level an obligation might be, I expect you can be able to demonstrate you can populate this element. And then as you go with more specificity further down, you incur additional expectations and impacts around system behavior. So the most narrow version of this code is will send, which means effectively, if you have a value and it's appropriate for you to send it, you will always send it. So it does get more and more specific as we go down the chain. The reason I bring this up is because as a base or a baseline or even a core, we have to think about the level in which we have influence and impact and the degree of specificity that often bases have, or the lack of specificity that bases will put in terms of system behaviors compared to an implementation guide or a profile that you write for how your registry will respond to a structured query. So keeping that in mind, there are some codes that have been developed that might make sense for us to look at that speak to behaviors associated around data absent reason. So if I'm in the producer space, which I think in this create update, we're talking about a client, which would be the producer of the resource. And in the query one, it's a server, which would also be the producer of the resource. So these two scenarios or these two statements might fall under something like use reason. So I think there's also another one underneath will present, which might be a little bit more tied to interface display. But for use reason, so the definition and the display is you should, and I think this is still being defined, provide an element with the data absent reason or a null flavor if a value is not known and an element is mandatory. So that's distinct from saying, just tell me that you are capable of producing a value for this element and having your must support end at that point. Do we think that when we say you shall send or relay the data element populated with a value to a server, that and the inverse, which is don't send anything if there is no value, fits in something like this? So this
In my mind,
Yeah.
Or case D fits that, but not the case C.
Yeah, and can send, I'm struggling to find value. I think that could have been labeled might send,
So I
might
think
not.
can send is usually tied to conformance and certification processes. So if you have a test case that says a vendor must be able to demonstrate that, that's typically can send behavior.
I would think that would be will send, isn't it?
So this would imply system capability. Will send would imply what you do with production data.
What? Sorry, can you?
So
Can
can
you
send means you need to be able to demonstrate that you are capable, your system is capable of populating, of interacting with this information during conformance testing purposes, whereas will
But
send.
no guarantee, right? But no guarantee that where it's needed to be used,
Yep.
you'll actually send it.
Yep, or yeah, that if you have a value, this doesn't carry the expectation that if you had a value and it was appropriate for you to send, that you would send it. That's saved for will send.
And there's a certification stamp for that.
Yep.
That I find that bizarre. But okie dokie.
Well, I think we've been reviewing will send, particularly in the international application access, and one of the challenges that both a international domain guide and bases and cores have is that oftentimes we work with, for instance, like our jurisdictional implementers that want to have more control over effectively what their receiving systems can anticipate that they will receive, and they don't want to necessarily have like business rules and rules that impact the instances of data, all determined at a very higher level in the chain. So there is sometimes some benefit to choosing, at least in the IPA route, a lesser degree, because we're saying we need to know the systems can do this, but we're going to leave it up to the implementing guides to define what is done and how far they want to take their vendor in their expectations as they relate to instances.
Right, but what you need to test conformance to, though, is an implementation level profile, not an abstract profile.
Actually did mess up a little bit. Actually, just this really reminded me, call back to the very beginning, the draft, the Graham he mentioned. I didn't understand back then. Might still get a wrong message from his draft today, but I only go to trial and error message and see. He said there should be 3 groups about obligation. Now I had a better understanding, which is one, the actor you just point out, Sheridan, which is the resource producer, receiver, whatever. Another one is called a capability statement perspective of obligation can send, one example. Another one's will send, which is a fall in the authentication authorization. And so that's why you can see this audience said bringing quite lots of questions here. You know, they blend the 3 different, domains or different fields into one table. I mean, that's why they call the draft experiment. They need. I do believe with those.
You really should have 3 different. I think what you're saying is we've got one code system here.
Yes, unfortunately, there should be 3
different value sets.
There should be 3 separate categories, code values. Yeah.
So we aren't like the C baseline. We don't have conformance testing processes. We don't have these demonstration expectations, but we also like play the role of a baseline, right? Something that's much closer to a base than like an implementation guide. And so when we're looking at these codes, is it like how important is it for us to try to think from a demonstrative perspective in what our current expectations are versus like our expectations as a baseline aligned to what we think should show up in instances? is it that we want the vendor market to be capable of doing these things, or are we saying they should act predictably all the time and that that's appropriate at our level of what our guide is supposed to do?
Let me suggest an answer which may be slightly different than the question that you're asking. I think the intention here should be to specify what the information requirements are. So if we're either going to have data elements which are required, in which case they're required, right? There's certain rules as to how you deal with those. You want to be able to specify on those whether or not they can send a data absent reason or they can't. Then for all other data elements, which are therefore optional, you need to be able to indicate, is this part of the information set that's part of our focus? Or is this not part of the information set, which is part of our focus, right? And if it is something that we expect people to deal with, then we should be indicating that we're expecting them to provide a value should they have one. The other ones that we don't care about, we don't care about. We don't require them to send a value if they have it.
And so does that align to, like, I think that's very close to what we're saying here, right? Which we are saying up here, if you have the information and it's populated, relay it.
Right, and that's why you flag those optional fields with must support. Because what you're saying is, you got to send the requireds, and you've got to send the must supports should you have a value for it.
But we just say capable of sending here.
Well, I don't know what there's. You can remove the word capable.
Capable is just there to handle a case whether you have it or you don't.
Right.
Have it, obviously send it. If you don't have it, then you're not capable of sending it, right? So
By virtue of the fact that you don't have one.
Right.
Right. You have the ability to send. So they must have the ability to send it should there be a value.
Yeah, and I
Right.
suppose we do say this is not capable in this server scenario. It shall send relay if populated and available and appropriate. Here.
Yeah.
So do folks think that, like, this is that just given how we have defined, at least for this scenario where things are optional but must support, where our expectation is send relay if you have something and it's available and appropriate, that maps to what we're seeing over here on the will send? And is it safe to assume then everywhere we see something is optional and must support, that we consistently meant this?
Yes. And I don't know why they're saying shall should.
Does anyone have a lesser degree of confidence around, you know, how we've applied must supports in optional scenarios, that in some places maybe we didn't intend for it to carry over the expectations around, you know, your expectation is your system will always send it if it's appropriate and you have something.
I think that's describing.
Sorry, one more time.
I think that will send description there kind of fits with what we were thinking when we wrote up this other chart.
Yeah, because otherwise, Sheridan, what you're saying is, the questions you're asking is, when you label things must support, did you sometimes mean, maybe not?
Yeah, and it's
Right,
hard because we had 3 separate streams, entities, medications, and clinical, that were all run separately. And so I think in going through this process collectively, I'd like to think we've honed in on that. But if we do think, well, there's some places I've seen that maybe that doesn't fit, then it may make sense to take a more nuanced approach. And like when we go to look at how do these translate, rather than making a blanket statement, this means this, to try to maybe target some of the areas where we feel maybe this is actually too strong for what we meant.
I don't know how you have something weaker and useful. Because the only thing I can see that's weaker than that is we might send the data. You are required to might send the data. And what kind of requirement is that?
Well, I'd make the case that most bases that are out there, aside from us, don't use an equivalent to must support at all. So there is no expectation of system demonstration of behavior, which, given that there are 30 that exist out there, they do convey alternative constraints without stepping the line into beyond a couple areas around like sub-elements, what systems are expected to do with a base or from a base.
Well, so getting concrete in your profiles, you will have some elements, the base profiles, which are required. All the rest of the elements are optional. Do you have any requirement for people to send you any of those optional elements if they have the data? If so, you should tell them.
So folks that use the baseline profiles and have looked at them and thought about how you'd use them in your jurisdiction, does taking a stance around will send, which is whenever you know a value and it's populated and appropriate, you send it. Does that work just as well as what we have here when you want to be able to use it in your jurisdiction?
Okay, but you are you asserting that obligation on every optional field or only on some?
What do folks think?
Word.
Sorry, Randy?
Say where we're looking at to put that as just for the ones that say must. 0.
Yeah, so it may be that your object that you're profiling has 20 fields. 5 of them may be required. Of the remaining 15, there might be 6 optional fields that you care about in a given use case. Those are the ones that you would mark as must support.
In the use case, but not in the baseline.
No, in the baseline, if you have none, then you'd mark none. If you had 4, you'd mark 4. You just need to be mindful that the 4 that you mark as must support are things which everybody else would use or add to, right? Because they can't undo it.
And so status is one that we talked a little bit about the last session as like very commonly something that we've applied a must support to across our profiles, and something that may have more cases where, you know, a system or a specific care setting may not, let's say, individually like capture statuses. So the example I think that we talked about 2 weeks ago was a system that only ever submits information about completed immunizations. Is there a way that we can evaluate the way this against how we've applied must support on status that
I would expect that everything that they sent in would have the status of completed, or if they were a receiver, that they would require that everything that came in the door had the status of completed. So though they may not retain that value because they know it's fixed in all circumstances for them, they have no confusion in terms of their ability to either validate it or generate it.
What about on the receiver side? So we talked about will send, and that covers 1/2 of it.
The only issue we've had expressed from our business side is concern over those things that, how to put it, if you that having that status that you send in is always a fixed value, you have to expend a certain amount of cycles processing it to make sure that it's still there, even though you're not really using it.
So would
So that was a concern they
separating,
expressed.
would separating a consumption expectation be helpful in that?
I really have no clues how to get around that, because other than, I mean, if you don't put that status in at all, then you don't waste the cycles trying to decode it. But any other use case, you're going to need it there. And how do you handle that? So I'm not sure what
And-
the solution is.
Yeah, and statuses, and from what I've observed, are typically required.
Mhm.
So discussing must support on that is not meaningful.
I think it does become meaningful though, if we start talking about expectations that impact what a receiver does with it. Or,
Oh, if
yeah,
it's a required field and the receiver receives it and it does, and the element isn't there, I would strongly recommend that they reject it.
And gets back to that case of we're always sending the exact same value because we only accept completed immunizations. If you don't send it, we have to reject the immunization. Or you have to process to look to see that it says completed before you can accept the immunization, when it's just extra overhead that's really not serving any purpose, because you won't ever get one in that wasn't completed.
Well, really?
In our use case, that's how it works.
Unless it's an error, right?
Even then, what they do is everything.
So if I send you a draft one, you're gonna suck it in anyway, because hey, it should have been completed.
Well, you're not supposed to send a draft one.
Be that as it may, the purpose of validation is not to catch, is to catch things that don't, in fact, aren't conformant or don't meet business rules.
And that would be caught on the looking at the source system saying, why are you sending this out when you haven't finished it?
Oh, if that was the case, then we wouldn't, we could
Right.
cut in half the number of computers that we actually use. Right? We do validation on the
All I'm
receiving.
saying is this is what our business team presented as their concerns. They didn't want to have to have a whole bunch of different fields that they don't actually use, but they have to spend a whole lot of time validating and rejecting messages if they weren't filled in right.
Well, I mean, that's why I would flag must support on the fields that you expect to receive, so that people aren't sending you the rest of the fields.
And that goes down to the use case rather than the baseline level. Yeah.
Yeah, but at the baseline, right? How many fields in the baseline are required? Or are
Not very many, but this is where I'm saying in
often
certain
needed,
cases,
right?
that status
It should be
being
very
must
few.
support creates issues.
Well, there shouldn't be many.
No, there's not many, but there's a few.
Yeah.
I was surprised to find out about them too. So
does the separation of no error, meaning like if you, and I interpret, maybe you guys interpret this different, but I'm interpreting valid value, meaning like, does it fall into the character limits if it's a codable concept that is, like valid meaning like, is it good JSON versus valid meaning is it the code I expected? That no error on a receiving or a consumer side, it is more flexible for that scenario, Randy, than something like must handle, which means like you're saying that you will understand the meaning of the values that come through and behave differently, behave somehow because of it. Does having a no error consumer obligation help you
for those kind of elements, it would.
for status kind of elements? So if you-
How do you, I mean, can we apply that to employees too? But how do you have a no error requirement? It's a goal.
This is saying is you just don't care what's there. You're not going to reject the message regardless of what value is there.
So are you gonna, okay, so there tends to be a difference between financial handling of information and clinical handling of information.
in the financial space, detection of an error tends to be taken as canary in the coal mine. And if an error is detected, then the entire exchange would be rejected. Because there could be other things that look fine, which are also in there. On the clinical side, there's less likelihood that people do that. And very often they just ignore, they reject the things which are errors, but just that part of it, or don't pull it into their system, but they accept the rest of it that they can't detect as an error. I'm very much in the former camp.
Well, I just know that some of our business processes essentially require that no error treatment pathway.
Yeah, but how do you how do you implement that? You assume no errors and therefore don't check for it?
Well,
Or
as I said, they check on the sending application, make sure it's not sending stuff when it shouldn't be. And then you track what comes in. And if somebody starts sending stuff they shouldn't have been sending, then you get it fixed.
sorry, but then what do? Reject everything they send in because they sent one thing that was
Well,
wrong?
no, they don't reject the stuff because they've got to get the information in. So they need to know, because it's clinical, they want to have the information.
And I see
Okay,
this
so it's
cannot be processed, like, so this note about, you can still be able to inform the user that something couldn't be processed, but you just can't reject the information as a whole out of
Right.
hand.
So you would log in that you got some value other than.
Well,
you have to think, and then somebody has to go back and investigate.
Sorry, one more time,
Right.
Randy?
So you would get the situation where you got something other than completed on an immunization. We would record that immunization and record the flag that something else was there. In this case, if we had the value, and you have to investigate later to see why did that come through. Or in the case where we don't have the value, you just won't see it.
applications still able to inform users of value from the process, which are unable to reject the information. I don't. Okay, this is the first I've seen this, and I'm not understanding what I would do with it. Am I saying sorry, I'm not saying if the content there is in error, I won't complain.
Yep, you just won't fatally complain.
Well, but I can't process it.
Well, so like this is the other piece I'm reading here, or ignore the element value so you can't reject the information out of hand or ignore the element value in order to process the resource correctly. Meaning, like, I think what they're saying is you can't strip it in order to store the record in your system. You got to store whatever you have, or you can't reject it, and you can't perform a secondary process to do something to it to prevent you from rejecting it.
I'd be interested in seeing an example of where anybody would find that useful.
The only thing I would do with that would never.
I can't think readily of an example where I would ever code a field that way.
So I think in the example we talked about earlier, where your system expects completed, your profile says this is probably likely going to be fixed, but you get something that doesn't say completed. That it would mean you wouldn't reject that immunization record altogether. You wouldn't strip out the status just so that you could consume the information. And it's different than saying, and I have to have my system do something and know the meaning of the values that come through, even if they're not the ones I maybe predicted, maybe. I don't know, maybe that's too far of an interpretation.
So I send you an instance with the status flag being entered in error. What do you do with it? You're not going to tell me about it. You're not gonna reject it. Really?
Dash, I saw you come off mute. Was it around,
Oh. Yeah, I was just reading the third column. It just says conformant application should accept resources containing any value for the element without error. So like the consumer, in this case, is receiving something and it has a valid value. And it should handle that without error, but I don't really understand the nuance there. Like if you're sending a valid value, where would the error really come from? Yeah, just a bit confused on what it means entirely, I guess.
and where valid is coming into play? Is it valid as opposed to your implementation guide or valid to the FHIR specification? So maybe that's
Yeah.
something that we can post about on chat.fhir.org for clarification and maybe start our discussion on next time.
Yeah,
Valid
initially-
going to the profile.
Okay, yeah, because initially
Right?
when I was, oh, go ahead.
If you profiled something down, then the requirements specified on your profile supersede prior profiles with the FHIR spec.
So for example, if like your profile only accepts like a gender of male, female, but like the resource above has like more codes, then if you were to accept like one of the other gender values, it shouldn't error out type of deal.
Let's put that to
Well,
the community and see. 'Cause,
Yeah.
Yeah,
That
I
would no
think it
longer
would
be a valid, that would no longer, yeah, so using your example, if the base spec had a value set with 12 values, and the profile that this claims to be conformant to only has 2 values, then if some value other than one of those 2 is supplied in the instance, it's non-conformant. So you would object to this one, even if the field was flagged as no error, because it's not a valid value.
be a secondary situation, yeah. But I do have to stop, folks, because I'm going to stop recording, because we are at time.